This is a lecture about the beginnings of English literature, and the first literature in English goes back to the period between 410 AD and 1066. This is also known as the early medieval period. And Old English was the language of the first literature in English, and it was a long time before it was actually written down. The first stories and poems were spoken, and we don't know exactly when the first stories were told. At this time in England there were two cultures, the Christian culture, which had arrived in England in 597 with St. Augustine, and the heroic culture, which was a culture of leaders and heroes who defended their lands against invaders. And the Norman conquest and the Battle of Hastings in 1066 was the last successful invasion of Britain. And the Normans, who came from France, took power, and William the Conqueror became the King of England. The Normans brought with them many French influences, and the French language began to mix with Old English to a more modern language. And Scandinavian influences were also strong, and Latin was still the language of the church, so there were many influences on the English language and culture. Out of these influences, a national identity began to develop, and the Magna Carta of 1215 reduced the power of the king, giving more power and property rights to the aristocrats. And the first parliament was in 1265, and in 1362 English became the language of law. The first literature of Old English was influenced from many different cultures, languages, and places, and the texts written were about familiar subjects such as war, religion, personal sadness, and personal happiness. Christian monks in the monasteries were the first ones to write down the early literature, and this was because they were the only ones that could read and write at this time. Cadman's Hymn is one of the earliest poems in Old English, and it was written in about 670. And take a look at the letters and wordings. They're quite different from the English that we know of today. The most famous Old English poem is Beowulf, and Beowulf was written down in the 8th century, but is believed to have been told already in the 6th century. And Beowulf is considered to be the first hero in English literature, and he was the man who could win battles and give safety to his people over a long period of time. And many of the earliest books during this time were histories rather than imaginative writings, and these writings have given us most of the information that we have about this period. And now we're going to listen to a piece from the Beowulf prologue in Old English. After the Old English period came the Middle English period, which was between 1150 and 1485. And in the Middle English literature, the earlier hero now became a man of romance, and love poetry entered the literary scene. And also women began to appear in the poems, usually as the object of desire and perfection, but also as human beings with feelings of their own. And there was heavier influence from the European writers in the English literature during this time. And the first histories created a sense of national and historical and mythical identity for the English people. King Arthur became an important figure from the dark history of wars and troubled times, and he became the symbol of English histories for many centuries. And King Arthur was also one of the first stories printed in 1485. And Layman, he was one of the first authors who actually saw himself as a writer of history, and he wrote the piece Brut in the late 12th century. And Brut is considered to be an important text in the history of writing in English, and the themes in Brut can be found much later on in literature. And many of the writers of Middle English period reflect themes of love and death. And medieval literature also questions society, making its reader think about the times they live in, as well as giving a picture of the fast-changing society of the time. Geoffrey Chaucer is one of the best-known names in English literature, and he is considered to be the first great poet of the nation and the language. And Chaucer wanted to make English literature equal to European literature. And his most famous piece, of course, is the Canterbury Tales, which was written between 1387 and 1400. And Canterbury Tales is a series of linked stories told by a group of people on their way from Southwark to Canterbury. And these people tell many different kinds of stories: secular, religious, moral, classical, and modern. And Canterbury Tales is a poem that consists of 17,000 lines, and it's considered to be a mirror of its times because Chaucer is describing a society that's changing, and its people and their values are changing too. The storytellers contrast old ways of behaving and thinking with more modern attitudes. And religion is less important during this time, and the new ambition is to make money. And this is a map that shows where in England the Canterbury Tales take place. And they started walking in London, Southwark, and then went along the coastline here and down to Canterbury.